Okay, I'm just going to start. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this session on resistance to public health policy of a unique vector of the tobacco industry. So if you're in a session on methicillin-resistant TB, you're not in the right place. My name is Matthew Allen, and I'll be your facilitator. So we have a great lineup today of speakers with some really practical, down-to-earth experience of how the tobacco industry behaves, and no doubt with some really good suggestions about how we can deal with that behaviour. Article 5.3 of the WHO FCTC provides an excellent mechanism for frustrating industry activities. And at the WHO FCTC conference of the parties in India in a couple of weeks, we'll be discussing, I'm sure, those activities. And there's expected to be a very healthy debate over how parties can do a lot better in this area. The WHO Secretariat's paper to the COP sets out some efforts underway. And based on reports made to the Conference of the Parties by parties, a number of parties have in recent years developed legislation, they've developed codes of practice and some policy documentation, they've participated in regional meetings and trainings, etc. So there are some things underway. And in fact, 95 parties reported to the Conference of the Parties that they had taken some steps in the last 2 years. Reading through those reports, most of those steps are very minor indeed, and a lot of parties have done nothing, so there's a long way to go. Internationally, however, there are a number of things happening. The Union, of course, through the Bloomberg Grant Initiative, has 23 grants underway which have a full or partial focus on Article 5.3, and we'll be talking about one aspect of that today with the Brazil Observatory on monitoring tobacco industry. So there are some exciting things happening, and I'm sure we're going to hear about some cool things today. So without further ado, let's launch into it. I'll propose that each speaker takes approximately 10 minutes, so we can have a couple of questions, preferably clarification questions after each, and then hopefully time for discussion at the end. So first speaker is Anne Jones. Anne's been a tobacco control advocate for 20 years, including as a technical advisor for the union since 2007. Based in Australia and the Asia Pacific, Anne has received the Order of Australia for her work as CEO of ASH Australia and her work in contributing to one of the lowest tobacco use rates in the world. Since 2007, Anne has worked for the union in China on the first Bloomberg Grant Initiative grants for smoke-free cities and the lead up to the Beijing Olympic Games. She worked in the Philippines and currently in Vietnam on sustainable funding for tobacco control. Anne has also been a major contributor to several union publications and training programs. And today she's going to be speaking on global and national measures to protect tobacco industry interference, to prevent, actually not protect, tobacco industry interference in health and tobacco tax policies. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Matt. So this is a bit of a glorification of what I'm going to do today, calling it a status report. It's going to be a bit more of just an overview of the global and national measures that are in place to prevent tobacco industry interference in health and tobacco tax policies. I'm not going to say very much about the tobacco tax policies because Jean Teshy, who's going to be in our session, will be talking in more detail about that. Anyway, I'd like to thank the union, of course, for organising this session and for Matt for chairing it. Oh, sorry, I'll go back, go this way. I have no conflict of interest to declare. So the sources for the next 10 minutes are basically four. There's the long and inglorious history of the tobacco industry deception and interference, which I won't be reviewing. I think a lot of people know about that. We're talking today about the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, Article 5.3 and guidelines. That is what underpins our work on 5.3. And the COP7 reports on the progress of the parties, which are now online. This is the meeting that will take place in India next month. And the reports are salutary reading if you have time to look at them, if you're not attending. And then lastly, the union's toolkit for governments on Article 5.3 and the new index for tobacco control sustainability, which they're launching tomorrow, which does include 5.3 measures as part of sustainable funding. So just a brief overview. I wanted to just say a couple of words about why we should prevent tobacco industry interference. How do we go about measuring it? What does the big picture tell us so far? And are we really making that leap from monitoring, which we've done for years, to protecting or preventing interference in health policies. And lastly, just a few words on lessons learned and some next steps and opportunities. So I think this is just a quick recap because we all know why we should be preventing tobacco industry interference, but basically tobacco is a leading global cause of death and disease. Parties do have obligations to act under the FCTC Article 5.3, and there's of course now a number of global frameworks to improve health and sustainability and human rights. The tobacco industry's business model is really profit-driven, and it's expanding into low to middle income countries and based on the recruitment of children. The tobacco industry is also working very hard to keep tobacco taxes as low as possible and to resist 5.3 measures. So all of those reasons are why we need to really double our efforts on preventing tobacco industry interference. So how do we measure it? Globally, we mainly have the COP7 reports on progress by the parties, and I'm only really summarising those reports here because there's just a few important points to remember. One is that the tobacco industry has intensified its interference, legal threats, new alliances, even only this week there were reports in Reuters that they're trying to get a seat at the table for the COP7, and there's a lot of agitation there. So this is typical of their interference, that 2/3 of the parties have actually done some work on 5.3, and slightly more than 2/3 have been giving public access to information on tobacco industry activities. But it's not a lot of action on 5.3. 11 parties have 5.3 policies as part of national law, which is a good sign, but most have not adopted all the guidelines, but some of the guidelines. So that's a very brief sort of summary. So what does this picture tell us? It tells us first that the tobacco industry has intensified their threats and efforts to undermine the FCTC, that the Secretariat, of course, has initiated several actions since the last Congress of the Parties meeting, and they've established some knowledge hubs as one particularly on trade. They've also had a number of technical meetings, and they've set up some observatories with the support of the union. So, you know, there's a number of things that they have done which have been good steps towards doing more on 5.3. They've basically said in their summary that there are sufficient 5.3 tools and resources, but parties seem to lack the awareness of and the access to those tools. And so the Secretariat, and I know they'll discuss this at COP7, is considering, you know, establishing a digital platform that could centralise and coordinate 5.3 efforts. So the work goes on. Just on this question, which I think is quite important, are we moving sort of from mainly monitoring to protecting and preventing? Because we've done a lot of monitoring for years. There's some excellent websites available on this, and we've been exposing what the industry's been up to. And I think we have to sort of push on to the prevention side of this goal. So there has been an increase in the implementation in 5.3 measures, but more comprehensive efforts are needed, and by more parties, and that's really the conclusion of these global reports. And of course, transparency, I think, is a very important step, as is monitoring and exposing the tobacco industry interference. But these are early steps that have to happen, and they're only part of the solution. So what are some of the lessons learned? Again, that tobacco industry interference is increasing. It's not decreasing. It's at multiple levels, global, regional and local. There's a lot going on at the global level. That the Article 5.3 is the single best tool we have for exposing interference and protecting health economic policies, but it's not time-bound, and I think that's an issue for us to think about. And that progress on resources has happened, but we need to do a lot more systematic adoption of 5.3 measures at that global, regional and local level. So what are some of the next steps we could consider taking? Should we become, for example, far more aggressive and exposing what could be called government protection of the tobacco industry? You know, their lack of action, their lack of, you know, increasing the very, you know, lowly taxed tobacco products is an issue, and we could do something like a global scoreboard on 5.3, which you do every year, and I think that could be something worth pursuing. Should we focus our 5.3 efforts, since it's so broad and so all-encompassing, on achieving sustainable funding and therefore preventing tobacco industry interference in tax policy. So focus in on that as a very productive area. And this is a hard one. Can we change the tobacco industry's business model by using regulation, litigation, global actions? And there's been a few models proposed about that. Some opportunities I think we have. Can we intensify Article 5.3 implementation by global partners joining hands to prevent tobacco industry interference and save millions of lives as a result of that? Can we do more to promote 5.3 in the media and at global events? We've got the World Conference on Tobacco or Health in 2018. There's World No Tobacco Day every year, and there's international meetings on SDGs and so on. Can we call for 5.3 to be time-bound and seek global endorsement as well of the Index for Tobacco Control Sustainability, because its funding is critically linked to 5.3. We're not going to get sustainable funding unless we do something about 5.3. And can we, for example, pair countries for exchanges on 5.3 so that you might put a country that's done a lot on 5.3 together with a country that hasn't, that's struggling, and so that you would get some good sister-brother relationship happening there. Number 5, can we accelerate, do more? And you're going to hear from Luke in this session on the uptake of the protocol to eliminate illicit trade, because that's about protecting health policies and exposing, all the interference in tax. Can we also scale up the integration of 5.3 into grant schemes, into national plans, using indices? There's a 5.3 indices that's been developed as well. We've got toolkits, we've got training programs, we've got observatories. How do we do more to scale up? And lastly, and not least, I think we should give some thought to a graphic sort of scoreboard on parties' progress on 5.3. And so that you would have, for example, those in the red would be the low acting countries on 5.3. Amber would be, these are the countries that are getting ready, and green would be, the best. These are the countries that are doing, more comprehensive 5.3. So these are just some suggestions I think we can leave till discussion time, but I hope you'll all give some thought to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Before you sit down, we have time for a couple of questions if anybody has points of clarification or anything. Or we can hold them to the end when we have a discussion. Okay. Thanks, Anne. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Jean Tesh. Jean is a tax economist currently working on tobacco taxation projects with the Union, WHO and the World Bank office in Bosnia, as well as for the US Department of the Treasury's Office of Technical Assistance. She has worked and lived in the Balkans and Africa and taught economics at Emory University, the University of Delaware, and Sarajevo Graduate School of Business. Her research interests include the economics of tobacco control, transition economies, and public finance and public health issues. And Jean will be speaking today on countering tobacco industry interference in tax policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I you don't usually hear the word cool associated with tax. So I appreciate your introduction for the session. Okay, what do I hit on this thing to move it? There we go. Yes. Okay, I have probably way too many slides. I'm going to try to move fairly quickly. The major points I think are fairly straightforward and simple. I have some examples and then also some methods for dealing with. We know that increasing taxes on tobacco products, along with other tobacco control measures, are one of the probably the most effective way of decreasing tobacco use. And of course, since it is effective, the tobacco industry uses a number of ways to try to minimize tax increases. Stop, or usually they don't say stop, they say they just want to slow down or minimize. They use a number of different arguments for why they're going to be a bad effect from a tax increase, often backed up by studies. I was just in Slovenia last week, and they're worried about the catastrophic drop in revenues if they increase taxes. So, I mean, it's still happening. So tactics are some of the ways they manipulate prices to either bolster their arguments or even produce the data they want to make the argument. And we know methods are used again and again. These are not everything, but I tried to get some of the main ones. So some of the arguments, the usual. will not get, you can increase taxes, you will not get more revenue because there'll be more illicit trade because of the price difference between this country and your neighbors. Jobs, 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 and jobs. Production, if you're producing cigarettes, you're going to lose jobs. People will be fired because you're not selling as much. If you're farming, if you produce tobacco products, and poor farmers are going to be out of work. Retail, tobacco shops, kiosks will have to close. Hospitality industry, same argument. It'll close because no one's going to go. So no matter, everywhere you look in the economy will be badly affected by tax increases. And finally, of course, being humanitarians as they are, the poor are going to suffer if you increase taxes on cigarettes. Oops. So for kind of just to go to the main points before we go into detail, monitoring is important. We have to have independent sources of information. A lot of countries depend on the tobacco industry for the data, the basic data on pricing, on consumption, everything, illicit trade. So it's got to be independent information, and we need to make better use of other countries' experience, because this happens over and over again. It's overwhelming now that increasing taxes increases revenue and decreases consumption. Okay. Illegal trade. Luke's going to talk about some of the specifics on how, but it is true that if we raise taxes long enough and high enough, revenues will eventually go down. That's our whole point. We want people to stop smoking. But no one's there yet, or very few. And even then, if it hasn't stopped increasing, it's still at a high level. So when I was looking at this, it made sense to me that in the medium run, maybe 10 years, revenues might start tapering off, but it doesn't. If increases are high enough to have a good effect on the price, and then smoking, revenues continue to increase or at least stay stable. UK's been increasing taxes for 25 years. Revenues are stable. And I actually got the wrong graph for Australia because they're the ones who have extremely high prices. We can see that over 20 years, 91 to 2011, the tobacco CPI, that's all tobacco products prices, and this is real, this is net of inflation, it does not include inflation, have gone up 6 times. And revenue is still increasing. So, the takeaway is that in country after country, tax increases do increase revenues, they do decrease smoking, and that is even in places with illicit trade. I live in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it has very open borders, it's corrupt, they were all one country once, they all know each other, both on the tax side and the criminal side. There's a lot of illicit trade because of that, and yet still revenues are going up with tax increases in Bosnia. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. So what does cause illicit trade? Informal trade channels and easy border access. That's in the Balkans where I live. Weak governance, ineffective tax and customs administrations. Corruption, complicity of producers and importers. Likelihood of getting caught, and low penalties. There will always be small scale. People, if you live on a border, you can go across the border and bring in your 2 cartons. But we're talking about the large scale, where most of the illicit trade is. Bottom line, there's room to increase tobacco taxes in almost all countries. Only 33 countries have tax levels that are more than 75%. That includes value-added or sales tax. Only 33 of the 180 that have signed the FCTC. South Africa, this is a classic graph. You see the price, tax, and prices going down, consumption's going up, the red. You start increasing taxes, increasing prices, consumption comes down. And this is one of my favorite graphs. These are medium from survey, these are media reports. So this is coming from the industry on illicit trade in South Africa. And it's around 20% going up slightly and then to 25. And every year, it's alarming growth. It's expected to grow, doubled in 2010. Well, no, it didn't. Or the last one where it says it used to be 8%, but now it's 25. They'll also change the numbers from 5 or 10 years ago so they can say that it's a big increase. Euromonitor does that actually on a regular basis as well. This is why we need independent sources of data. Moving on to jobs, production. The number of jobs in producing cigarettes has gone down, but it is not because of taxes. It is because of mechanization. It's very cheap and easy to produce a lot of cigarettes. The other is consolidation. Like a lot of different businesses, there's been a huge consolidation. It's continuing. 5 companies controlled over 80% in 2011, and almost half of that is China, so the 4 private companies. BAT is now going to buy Altria, which is the number 5th private company, so that's going to take it above to number 1 worldwide. So we're talking about a very small group of multinationals controlling almost all of production. And they make decisions based on their profits. They move factories, they move whatever based on profits, certainly not on tax levels. Farming has also become more concentrated. China produces, we saw a couple days ago, about half of global supply. Africa, although certain countries are highly dependent on tobacco, it actually produces only 10% globally. But for Malawi, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, it's high. So we do have to think about helping poor countries, help their farmers go to alternative crops, which often can be more stable and more profitable. A lot of tobacco farmers get caught in the cycle of having to buy the fertilizer and seed from the tobacco companies, and then they sell to it, and they never quite get out of debt. So farming, it's correct that we need to think about farmers, but it is not the issue that the tobacco companies have portrayed it to be, in most cases. Retail jobs, and I would also include the hospitality industry in this. Basically, cigarette purchases are moving anyway into more formal, either petrol stations or supermarkets. But that is in middle income to higher income. A study of over 20 years in U.S. states found that there was no effect of higher taxes, higher prices on convenience stores. And even in lower income countries, most kiosks are not selling just tobacco. They're selling candy bars, magazines, top-ups on your phone cards. So it's not, if they sell fewer cigarettes, it's not going to put them out of business. And the other thing that the tobacco companies tend to exaggerate because it's in their interest, it's not like this money disappears. If people are not buying cigarettes, it's not gone for the economy. They're spending it on something else. It's merely a transfer of expenditure. It is not a loss to the economy. But that's what it is portrayed as often. Finally, the poor. All indirect taxes, including value-added tax and sales taxes, they affect the poor disproportionately because poor spend more of their income on consumption. So by definition, an indirect tax, a sales tax or an excise tax, is going to affect them more. But of course, now we've done the research on the other side, and they're also more affected on the health side. If someone has chronic bronchitis and is missing work and they're poor, that is catastrophic for family finances. They're going to have less access to good treatment, and they also tend to spend less on more important things like food. Study in Bangladesh in the 90s found that household incomes less than $24 a month were spending 2 times more on if there's a smoker on tobacco. Average males spent 2 times more on tobacco products than clothing, housing, health, and education combined. So raising taxes to increase the price of cigarettes can actually increase living standards because poor people and like young people will quit more than others. And I'm going to keep moving because we're running out of time. Okay. Tobacco companies manipulate prices for several reasons. One, to bolster their arguments that illicit trade will increase, and the other, to increase profits or maintain market share. One of the methods is stockpiling, and again, I just heard this in Slovenia. The Ministry of Finance was trying to tell me that in Latvia and Lithuania, when they increased their prices in 2009, revenues dropped the next year. Yes, it did because of stockpiling. The year after that, it went back up again and stayed up. This is when you have a tax increase coming. Countries, but if you have a stamp system or whatever, they'll stockpile more and then they'll sell them for the lower price, or the lower tax. And that means that you'll see releases will be very high before a tax increase, and then it drops, and they'll say, okay, see, there's more illicit trade. You see, we don't have the sales. Here's an example in the Philippines with their big increase in 2013. You see right before, this is monthly, going higher than normal and then a big drop. So for several months, well, it actually takes probably a little over half a year to recover in levels, but this was not because of illicit trade. This is because of the stockpiling. And some change in habits, but. Another is overshifting or undershifting, which is simply when you have a tax increase. Overshifting means the tobacco companies increase the price more than the tax. It's convenient in a way because they can blame an increase on the tax increase instead of on their profits. Most cigarettes are very cheap to produce, so they have very good profit margins. But they can hide a price increase with a tax behind a tax increase. Most people don't go out and figure, okay, 10% was from the tax, the price went up 15%, oh, they got some too. They just notice that tax prices have gone up and it's easy to blame the tax increase. Undershifting is the opposite, and it might make not sense. Why would you cut into your own profit share? But they do it to keep market share. If they can keep prices lower, not increasing as much as the tax increase, people will not reduce consumption as much, and therefore they can keep their market share. That's true in the Balkans. We have high taxes in some countries, well, Bosnia, and low prices because there's so many people smoking, they want to keep those people smoking, even if they have to take a little cut in the profit. This is a nice case of Ukraine. The red is the profit margin, the price and the industry price. The others are the taxes. It's two kinds of excise and VAT. And you see that taxes are coming down until January 2008, and also the profits are keeping market share. But it took big increases in 2009, starting in 2009, where taxes started to back up. I mean, taxes increased a lot, and then they had to start increasing margin. They can't keep decreasing their profit margin forever, but they can do it for a while. I mean, for years here. So this is trying to keep market share, but finally the tax increases were high enough that they had to start raising prices too. Okay. This is just some background, some ways to limit stockpiling. This will be on the website, and also I have some sources here for other. So basically, as I said before, we have to have monitoring. We have to know what is happening to prices before and after. If we depend on the tobacco industry, we've lost our argument already. And it's not just state-owned countries like Vietnam with state-owned enterprise, state-owned tobacco that rely on that. It's in Morocco, it's private, and they still get all their information from the industry. Okay, Uganda. This is an example of dealing with it. There was an attempt at a tax increase in 2011, and there was a lot of pushback, and basically Parliament did not pass. They passed a much smaller increase. Both parliamentarians and civil society mobilized, they got organized, and in 2013, 2 years later, they tried to do another big increase, and they were ready. So they had fact sheets, they had estimates on what's going to happen to health and to revenues, and they lobbied Parliament, they got on the news, and they were able to successfully get an increase, a big increase through. In Vietnam, where they have a state-owned tobacco company industry, they get almost all their information from the industry. So what they're starting now with first identifying the gaps in data, and then setting up an economic working group to provide independent data on prices, on impacts, on being able to do analysis, so that they're ready for tax increases. They don't have to rely, or will not have to rely solely on the tobacco industry. Conclusions, only two. Okay. We know that the tobacco industry uses the same arguments. And unfortunately, it still works, so we have to be ready. We've got all the evidence from other countries. It's overwhelming at this point. We need to make it more available so people can, when there's a problem, they know where to go and we can argue. And we also have to have the data, independent data, and ability to do analysis, both. Wherever it is not so much important as long, it can be in the Ministry of Finance, it can be in civil society, it can be in academia, just as long as it's not from the tobacco industry. One thing ministries of finance can do, and this is best practice in tax in general, is to make the information available, at least on tax revenues. Many countries put all tax revenue data online, so it's easy to get. And finally, use of multi-sectoral groups that can include ministries of finance, tax, administrations, ministries of health, members of parliament, civil society, in order to mobilize like they did in Uganda to be ready, to have the analysis and be ready to support tax increases. And I have lots of sources here if people want more. Also, if you, afterward, if you want any more, but just there's some good studies out there on some of these various topics. A little bit over. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Jean. Time for a quick question or two if anybody has any. Okay, hold on to those thoughts then. Thank you. Right, our next speaker is Savannah Tusi. Savannah is the co-founder and a researcher at the Centre for Studies on Tobacco and Health at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. Savannah has experience in public health with an emphasis on occupational and environmental toxicology. Areas that she's focused on in her career include policies for tobacco control, occupational and environmental cancer prevention, and qualitative and quantitative studies with small tobacco farmers and tobacco production. And today she'll be speaking to us about the observatory on the strategies, observatory established in Brazil to monitor the strategies of the tobacco industry. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here and share our experience, mainly for the organization. Let me see. This is our castle. Is here where is the Center of Studies on Tobacco Control is inside the National Public Health in Brazil. Our project is patrocinated for Alpa. It's so fast. I don't know when I'm back. Okay. The observatory is not possible without the support with the partners. Since you start in 2014, the Union, the FCTC, the Alliance on Tobacco Control, a National Cancer Institute, and CONIC have been this support and financial and technical support for our project. It's important to remind the creation of the observatory is linked with the Article 5.c and FCTC. The treaty requires the parties must protect the tobacco policies. So there is an important effort to strengthen the parties. We discussed in the COP setting about we have a small session to discuss what the importance the hubbles and the observatories, because the FCTC has intention to building different observatories around the world, mainly in the countries from the BRICS country, like India, China, South Africa, and Russia. So I believe that Brazil is the first observatory was in functioning. We are guide for the 4 principles from FCTC. I would like to highlight the principle 1, because it's fundamental and reconcilable, the conflict between tobacco industry and the public health policies. And our interests should be accountable with the tobacco industry is transparent. And the 4th principle is big one for us too, because their products are lethal, and the tobacco industry should be not granted incentive to establish, to run this business. So we know the tobacco industry is the same around the world. You cannot forget they are dealing with industry is acting the same way around the world, like in Brazil, Uruguay, Kenya, and India or Union European. Are trying to interfere with the autonomy and to manipulate the pollutions according to these interests. Sorry. So the objectives our observatory is protect tobacco control policies in Brazil from the interference of the tobacco industry, of course. You'd like to establish a tobacco industry monitoring system and to disseminate informations and promote academic studies about these strategies. When you start, our first view was about the tobacco tactics from the Beth University, from Gianna Gilmore, said to us initial support. After this, the tobacco industry monitoring database from WTO, and now we use so much the legacy tobacco documents from the University from California. They has a lot of information and documents. We collected the sources for the magazines, academic papers, official documents, videos, photos, a lot of international Brazilian press is put together inside what I show you next. We put together the 6 different strategies and tactics because we needed to pedagogical form to reunite these documents. So we'll choose to separate in maneuvers to reach the political and legislative process, how the industry exaggerates your economic importance, how they manipulate the political opinion to gain respectability, how they fabricate support through front groups, how discrediting the proven science to create doubt about the evidence scientific, and how they intimidated the governance with the litigation. I would like to put the click in website, please, here. I don't know if it's possible to put and run in the screen. You can? No. Okay, this is the real one. We have 3 different versions in Portuguese, in Spanish, in English. So stop. Go down, please. We have some informations about how you can to collaborate with the observatory. Near you have, stop please, the strategies and tactics from the tobacco industry, like I said in the slide anterior. You have to the organizations and people to link it direct or indirectly with the tobacco industry. Here in down, you have every day or every week the news about the tobacco industry strategies. Is necessary because the people to use can every time know about what the industry can, this about the law, about the a lot of strategies they make, like some action from the deputies, from the senators, or other kinds of people to link the tobacco industry. Okay, can you stop? Yeah. So I will show some fastly I can the different kinds of documents you put inside the observatory. This is news. And the Folha do Mate is a journal, is a newspaper from Rio Grande do Sul to support the tobacco industry. He every time speak about how glorious is the tobacco industry. The Santa Cruz is another newspaper. This website is from the city. It is the municipality from the Santa Cruz do Sul. This talking about the group to defend the tobacco industry and the producers. Here is another document important because they speak about the strategies to influence the government. Here is an important the photo because in the center you can see the president of the Senate and the Senate Ana Amélia. Tanya said about her yesterday. They received, for example, $15,000 to elections to 2014. Around you can see the deputies, senators, and others, the tobacco defenders. How can we can say they exaggerate the economic importance of the tobacco? You can say a lot of your documents tell about how Souza Cruz, the British American tobacco, has impact, economic impact about the tobacco growers and farmers in the cities, how the tobacco is important for the economic importance in Brazil, or how many money they put inside the economy, or whatever. And they every time said about how he is, they are the best. This is one document about the prohibition. The British American tobacco was proved the support the labor, children labor, and the other kinds of irregularities in this municipality in Rio Grande do Norte. The Minister Public of Labor prohibited the company, the British American Tobacco, operates there. I would like to show you some examples, the documents from websites from the tobacco industry, websites for the agency to regulate tobacco, this Supreme Court, because we have accumulated for almost 20 years, a lot of documents to show, to prove how this industry acting in Brazil, in other countries too, because we have some documents from Uruguay, from Argentina, from Chile, Peru, and other countries to show the same things. So our idea is reunite inside these different strategies and can to show the people linked to tobacco control to make some analysis, propose some different policies. And this way we can go out, go in front, go for another part, because we believe is necessary to enforce our actions, and is more necessary to make this observatory like in other countries too. I think it's very important. The South Africa and the China and Russia maybe can build this observatory too, because when we reunited our observatories together, you can see the industry is the same all over the world. And you can propose some different politicians, and we can fight with another, in the end, against this industry, because we need to defeat, you need to organize a new age from this kind of this situation, because you can see every day how our people, to the small farmers, for example, are sick because they are contact the nicotine from the leaves. The industry, for example, said, no, it's not true, it's invention from the government. So when you can prove, when you show, the situation is better and better. In this kind of thinking, you need belief. You start with this project. Okay, this is my contribution. Sorry, because my English is not good, but I hope that you understand me. If you want to talk about after the session, I am here. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Savannah. Just before you sit down, just one quick question. The size of the organisation, I mean, what's your annual budget and the number of staff and such like? What sort of scale of operation?
We start in 2004, I and another people. We received initially $1,400 to start this project. We buy some computers, you reunite information from the CONIC, the Commission National, from the Alliance to Tobacco Control. And now we have two more people. One is a lawyer, other is journalist, the communicator too. Right. We have 4 people. But the Brazilian group to working in tobacco control is big. So different groups help us, giving us some photos and tapes and documents and newspapers. You separate and put inside our observatory.
Okay.
Okay?
Great. Yeah, thank you.
More
That's excellent.
no?
Any other questions or comments? No? Okay, thank you very much. It was really interesting. And there are a couple more, I think Sri Lanka, is it Sri Lanka and South Africa, yes, of course, so they're already underway. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, our next speaker, Jeff Collin. Jeff is Professor of Global Health Policy at the University of Edinburgh. He's a political scientist by background, and his research interests focus on health policy and global health governance, with a particular emphasis on the role of the commercial sector. He has particular interest in unhealthy commodity industries, with extensive research experience in examining how tobacco companies have sought to shape public policy. And he's speaking today on tackling conflicts of interest and promoting policy coherence.
Cool. He's also a bit confused by the pointer, so forgive me. Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here, particularly as part of this session. You know, so often you come to conferences like this and you see 4 or 5 random-looking presentations. I think these all fit together really nicely and make important contributions to what I think are really important debates. Mine might not look like it fits, and I'm conscious that it's kind of moving things outward a wee bit, but hopefully it picks up on some of the themes that have been introduced by Anne, Silvana, and by Jean, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll be convinced that I'm not completely crazy. These are always counselling sessions primarily. So going back to Anne's point about the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's really important when we think about 5.3 that we recognise we're making a big ask of governments. We're asking them to behave very differently than they do in most other areas of public policy. And that creates some challenges when it comes to implementing Article 5.3. And I want to illustrate this by contrasting the pattern of interaction that we expect with tobacco companies with partnership or voluntary approaches to other unhealthy commodity industries. I'm going to talk primarily about alcohol in this context, but I think you could certainly talk about ultra-processed food and beverage companies in this context. I want to suggest that tobacco isn't necessarily that different to some of these other industries, and I want to illustrate this. We're used to looking at this in terms of strategic similarities across companies. I want to suggest that we need to be thinking about the nature of of institutional and organisational links across tobacco, alcohol and ultra-processed food companies, and asking what this means for 5.3 and broader patterns of interaction with the commercial sector. And to suggest finally that doing so can give us some really big wins, that we can position regulating unhealthy commodity industries as key sites of intervention in tackling the social determinants of health. Okay, sorry, this much is familiar to all of you, I'm sure. One of the reasons why tobacco control has been successful, as I was saying this morning, is that we've taken conflict of interest seriously. We have regulated the tobacco epidemic as an industrial epidemic. And analytically, people are willing to extend this analysis to our understandings of alcohol, our understandings of obesity, but politically there's been much greater reluctance to begin to explore those kind of approaches. And we can see this as significant in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, because partnership with the private sector is presented as one of the real keys to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and this has some really quite perverse consequences. I've just come back from a meeting of the WHO coordinating mechanism on NCDs, which is all about creating dialogue with civil society, but also with industry. So there's a very strong presence there from the International Food and Beverage Alliance, and previous events have had strong presence from the alcohol industry. And I think ultimately this matters from a tobacco control perspective. As we've been hearing about, taking conflict of interest seriously, I think underpins every significant aspect of tobacco control policy and practice. We're all familiar with the phrasing of Article 5.3. I think that the key thing that I wanted to make here, though, is to recognise just how big an ask, how big a change of practice it is we're asking governments to make. That not all of what we see as failure to implement necessarily indicates bad will or failures of political motivation. It is a fundamental challenge to the way in which governments usually do business, and we've got to recognise that that's a big ask, especially when we're asking it of ministries outside of health. But I want to suggest that the kind of principles and practices that have become familiar with 5.3 are ones that could also be transported into other policy realms, and which would be important in broader strategies for addressing NCDs. The particular one way in which I want to illustrate this is by contrasting the UK government's attitude to the expansion of tobacco companies with that to the expansion of alcohol companies. So the UK has guidelines for its embassies, for its overseas posts, that restrict it from promoting the interests of tobacco companies overseas. So they're prohibited from lobbying against local government policies aimed at improving public health or engaging with foreign governments on behalf of the tobacco industry. And something that I think is important to note about this is that this practice, though it's been strengthened recently, this actually predates the FCTC. 5.3 didn't come out of anywhere, and similarly it's possible for us to begin to think about applying these practices in other areas without waiting for a framework convention to do so. But if we contrast, we've been doing some work recently on the way in which the UK government supports the global expansion of the alcohol industry. I'm actually based in Scotland, and as you may know, our Scottish government is very keen on independence. It's not pushing the case too much to say that's the economic case for Scottish independence depends entirely on selling whiskey to India. But it's a pretty big part of our industrial base, and the kind of strategies that UK and Scottish governments have used to support the alcohol industry is evident here. So we've got facilitating foreign direct investment in emerging markets, promoting privatisation in sub-Saharan Africa. So the Department of Trade and Industry's website boasts of how helpful they were to Diageo in buying up a brewery, a state-owned brewery in Ethiopia, securing tariff reductions, challenging regulation under WTO agreements, actively promoting industry interests in trade negotiations, and most extraordinarily, providing access to development aid. So the Department for International Development provides development aid to SAB Miller and to Diageo. It makes my head hurt thinking about it. But it does illustrate a much broader point about the limits of policy coherence in our approaches for dealing with NCD. So policy coherence here, we usually use it in global health to talk about the extent to which health priorities fit with trade priorities, but I want to think about coherence across different areas of health policy. And if we look at WHO's strategy, we can see there's a very big strategic divide between the FCTC on one hand and voluntary or partnership approaches, which are seen as useful in both the strategy on diet, physical activity and health and the global strategy to reduce the harmful use of alcohol. And it's not really surprising, therefore, that WHO finds itself in a great deal of strategic confusion when it comes to talking about these industries. So sometimes Margaret Chan will draw direct parallels and suggest that we need to regulate big food, big soda, big alcohol in the same kind of ways as we regulate big tobacco. So the quote on the left is from a health promotion conference in Helsinki. But in the much more politicized, more constrained context of the World Health Assembly just a month earlier, she drew a clear divide between the tobacco industry and other unhealthy commodity industries, which she described as industries that have a role to play in reducing the risks for NCDs. So there are no safe tobacco products, no safe level of tobacco consumption, but there are healthier foods and beverages, and in some cultures, alcohol can be consumed at levels that do not harm health. This might hypothetically be true. Nobody's been able to provide any examples of such cultures, but nonetheless. And as I say, this was played out in the context of WHO reform and the global coordination mechanism, where it's possible for the ultra-processed food industry and the alcohol industry to participate. This looks odd for all sorts of reasons, partly because we know that the alcohol and food industry tend to behave very similarly. The kind of strategies that Jean was describing in relation to taxation are now being played out in the context of soda taxes. So, for example, the Coca-Cola have used soda tax in Mexico to pass on and absorb price increases to consumers in very similar sorts of ways. But I want to look at it a bit more fundamentally and to look at links, at institutional links across companies. I'm going to do this by looking at SAB Miller, which until a couple of weeks ago was the second biggest second biggest beer manufacturer in the world. And one of the things that I think is interesting in moving from looking at the tobacco field to looking at alcohol is that the narrative of mature markets in the global north being replaced by increasingly targeting the global south, a narrative that's been politically really important in tobacco control, hasn't really been used in an alcohol context yet. But if we look at at this kind of blue line, the proportion of profits of its revenue that comes from Latin America, negligible in 2005, and less than a decade later, much the biggest region for the group, with much more to come from Brazil. I'm sure Silvana will be thrilled. And this, we're now dealing with the context in which we've got a level of consolidation in the global beer industry that dramatically exceeds that in the tobacco industry. So the merger between SAB Miller and AB InBev, third biggest merger in corporate history. What's really important is that this is a merger that's predicated almost entirely on the prospects of growth in Africa. So, the third biggest merger in corporate history is being driven by the prospects of increasing sales of beer in Africa. This matters in global health terms. It also matters in tobacco control terms, and this is where it gets a bit weird, but I've been doing some work looking at interlocking directorates, so people who sit on the board of company X who also sit on the board of company Y. And if we look at the board of SAB Miller, SAB Miller it used to be entirely owned by Philip Morris. It was still owned about 22% by Philip Morris, who got to appoint 3 members of the board as a result, Jeff Bible being one of them. When it came to appointing a new chief executive, they decided they needed even more tobacco industry expertise, so they appointed Jan du Plessis, a former chair of British American Tobacco, and appointed him explicitly with reference to his expertise in penetrating international markets in developing countries. I think it's reasonable to suggest that his expertise in managing increasingly stringent regulatory environments was probably relevant too. And this also means that they get to sit around the table with Trevor Manuel, the two-time head of the World Bank Development Committee, and John Manzoni, the head of the UK Civil Service. Incidentally, this gets much more interesting when you look at local operating companies. So the board of directors of Sousa Cruz, the Brazilian subsidiary, is genuinely terrifying when you look at who sits around the table. So you've got two former presidents of the Brazilian Supreme Court. You've got a former ambassador to WTO and to Washington. You've got the director of Latin America's leading think tank, as well as representatives of Hershey's and Coca-Cola. This is a pretty well-embedded organisation. Sorry, the John Manzoni thing, though, is interesting because ultimately he had to step down from the board of an alcohol company because of conflict of interest on tobacco grounds. He was charged with introducing minimum unit pricing in England. He was sat on the board of directors of an alcohol company. This wasn't seen as problematic until tobacco control activists pointed out, hold on, he's sitting around the table with tobacco industry folks. And so he had to stand down on grounds from an alcohol company on the grounds of conflict of interest with tobacco, which again is where my head starts hurting. And can we even call this an alcohol company? You know, if we look at the scale of the tobacco industry links that I've already spoken about, the merger between SAB Miller and AB InBev was driven by a group of Brazilian venture capitalists called 3G, who previously led the merger between Kraft and Heinz and the buyout of Burger King. One of the impediments to the deal between SAB Miller and AB InBev was that both had rival distribution deals, AB InBev with Pepsi and SAB Miller with Coca-Cola, which means that an alcohol company is the biggest distributor of Coca-Cola drinks in Southern Africa. Okay, so this looks a bit weird, but can WHO differentiate big tobacco from big soda, big food, big soda, and big alcohol? What are the implications that arise from across these industries? How can WHO never be on speaking terms with the tobacco industry, as Margaret Chan said, if it doesn't exclude collaboration with such closely linked companies? And what does this mean for the development of effective NCD policies in the context of the Global Coordination Mechanism and WHO reform? I want to suggest that if taking conflict of interest seriously is essential to us realising the potential of the SDGs, which have been criticised as not really addressing the commercial determinants of health. But actually, I think there's language in there that we can reinterpret to our advantage. So the goal 3, the health goal, ends with a call to strengthen the capacity of all countries, particularly developing countries, for the management of national and global health risks. We're well used to treating the tobacco industry as a national and global health risk. I think we also need to be treating the expansion of alcohol companies and of ultra-processed food industries in those kind of terms. And then while Goal 17 calls for partnerships, it also requires us to enhance policy coherence for sustainable development. I think it shouldn't be difficult for us to demonstrate that there's a lack of policy coherence if we're giving development aid to SAB Miller and to Diageo, and to suggest that we ought to be able to do rather more. More generally, I think that tobacco control's got a lot to gain from breaking down silos across NCD risk factors and working much more closely with alcohol and nutrition communities than we have done. This, I spoke recently at a joint event between Fresh and Balance, the alcohol and tobacco control NGOs in Newcastle, and it was one of the more exciting events I've been to, because there's a real willingness to explore common areas of interest. And to end on a rather glum note, you know, in the context of Brexit and the multiple challenges we're going to be confronting in terms of trade agreements, I think it's increasingly important that we explore common ground and try and work together rather more constructively than we have done. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Luke.
You raised about big tobacco, big alcohol, big food, but is there a difference between them? So, what's the answer?
Well, policymakers tell us that there is. But there's not a difference when it comes to their overall health impacts from a global health perspective. They're pretty comparable these days. There's not a difference when it comes to how they behave. There's not much of a difference when you come and look at these structures. And I think we've got to have a much better understanding. It goes very much to the kind of tactical monitoring activities that Silvana was talking about there. That very often it's the same front groups and organisations that these actors are using. If you look at the Institute of Economic Affairs, for example, and the wonderful Christopher Snowdon, who some in the UK will be familiar with, you could pretty much cut and paste the words tobacco, alcohol, gambling, soda across their reports, and they're all the same. The same kind of arguments being used by these libertarian think tanks to oppose public health more broadly. And I think we need to think rather more about the strategic significance of these linkages. I don't see much analytical or political difference between these organisations. But, you know, clearly there are still some distinctive attributes about the products, but in public health policy terms, I'm still looking for a convincing explanation of why we regulate these things differently.
Oh.
Anecdote. I read in Australia, it's a parliamentary inquiry. It's about obesity in children and soda tax. So myself and another professor giving evidence. One of the committee members is very aggressive, and later in the day we should be giving evidence by Skype for Christopher Snowdon, Institute of Economic Affairs, from London into Sydney. And the playbook is the same. The tactics are identical, so and global. So I thought your thesis and your argument really resonated strongly. And like some of the strategic responses, we'll want the same lawyers. Let's not confuse them, because it's going to be the same type of agenda across these issues. And so there are areas where we get kind of joined up solutions. We can be much more efficient. And a lot of the surveillance work is spot on. And it's about journal articles and science as well as interference.
I think so. I mean, I would also say that I think tobacco control needs to take its status as the big brother in NCD terms a bit more seriously than it has done. I do think sometimes we're a bit guilty of trying to pull the ladder up behind us when it comes to some broader policy discussions, including in trade contexts.
Tanya.
Short provocation on the, it's very amazing with all this work we have done linking the different companies, different kind of companies. Maybe we could find some linkage between the tobacco industry, such as Souza Cruz in Brazil, with the Monsanto, because they have a buyer, because they have very close engagement with the tobacco production. In Brazil, they have a kind of joint work to increase the quality of tobacco leaves in Brazil. I don't know if you find something on this, or and I have another question.
Sure.
Not another question, a comment.
Please.
Now.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah.
I think that Silvana has, for example, a very important tool for us, tobacco control advocate. I'm talking about Brazil. In Brazil, it's very important. One aspect that they are working very hard is to create a kind of denormalization of politicians receiving money from tobacco industry for election different companies. And I'm surprised that we don't have any Monsanto or Bayer in this
No,
network.
I think we would if we look closely. That was very kind of it was a chance one afternoon I was looking because I was interested. My hypothesis would be that there's still much higher levels of penetration of political elites and of development agencies on the board of tobacco companies in terms of their regional subsidiaries than there are in head offices where there's been a general decline of the great and the good being prepared to publicly sign up to and receive a tobacco industry check as publicly as they did in the past.
Okay, please.
Just one small observation. I'm from India and we are going to have COP7 there.
Yes.
And I come from Citizen News Service and we have been closely involved with, and whatever you have said, we have been talking of that also. In India, and they're talking of farmers' interests being jeopardized. It is the farmers, those are the politicians who are owners of the tobacco farms. Yeah. It is not the farmers who are working on the farms, their condition is miserable. And though we have that, the local cigarette which is called bidi, which is just rolled cigarettes. And I think more data needs to be collected on that whose economy is being affected. It is the politicians' economy which will be affected perhaps. And we have another trend right now. It has become, in the political parties, it has become fashionable to have alcohol ban in the state. There is one state, Bihar, you must be aware, it has done it already. Yeah. And we have been talking to the parties also to have a ban on tobacco, but perhaps they have their own interests, so nobody is taking that in their manifesto. But many other parties are coming on board. If we win the elections, we will have an alcohol ban. Perhaps they don't own alcohol companies. They are all private in India.
Yeah.
So, and my organization, we are writing a letter to all the COP members. And if you would like to endorse that address to the Minister of and Chief Prime Minister of India also, we would be very glad if you could endorse that letter. And I can give my address, and many organizations worldwide have endorsed it, and we are going to submit it before COP7.
It's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Okay, our last speaker today is Luke Jossens. Luke's the Advocacy Officer at the Association of the European Cancer Leagues and an international expert in illicit tobacco trade. Since 1994, he's authored and co-authored 30 peer-reviewed scientific articles on tobacco and illicit trade. Been heavily involved with both the INB for the protocol to eliminate the illicit trade in tobacco products and the actual negotiations, and he's been the lead author on a background paper on cigarette smoking for the 2000 World Bank report curbing the epidemic. He's also the recipient of 3 very high-powered international tobacco control awards. And today he's going to be speaking, not surprisingly, on illicit tobacco trade and the tobacco industry's involvement in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I will speaking on illicit trade, and I need 2 hours. Is that okay?
Go for it.
Well, I was the only one who was given only 10 minutes. The other had 20 minutes. It's not fair, but anyway. So the first question is, do I have a conflict of interest? I said no, but not sure because I come from Belgium. I live in a beer country, and I live in Leuven. And at 1 kilometer of my house, you have the headquarters of AB InBev. I have no link with them, so I come from Leuven, so it could be a conflict of interest. On illicit trade, so 10 minutes, I decided to give only one aspect of illicit trade. We have the illicit trade protocol, which wants to control the supply chain, to enforcement and greater international cooperation. The illicit trade protocol was adopted 4 years ago in Seoul. And what's the situation now? The situation now is that we have 54 parties which have signed the protocol and 24 parties which have ratified the protocol. We need 40 countries for the entry into force, which means 17, not 16 countries, because the EU doesn't count as a country, it's a region, so we still need 17. but we made progress. The last 10 months, we had 11 ratifications. So we expect that the entry into force will happen at the end of 2007, eventually beginning of 2018. And if this happens, then we will have a tracking and tracing system which should enter into force 5 years later in 2022. And if this happens, we should agree on standards on tracking and tracing systems a couple of years before, so that should be in 2019, 2020. So that's the focus of my presentation. The time is running because we have to decide on how we will organize tracking and tracing. So what is tracking and tracing? Tracking and tracing is you provide key information at the moment of manufacturing, such as where it's produced, when it's produced, where is it intended to go. And it should follow the product along the supply chain. We had the discussions and negotiations on this article, Tracking and Tracing, the most important article of the protocol in 2010. And it was very clear, coming back to the theme of this session, industry interference. It was clearly said at several occasions, it should be controlled by the party, it should not be performed or delegated by the tobacco industry. And if there are interactions with industry, and there will be interactions on the industry on tracking and tracing, because if you install unique codes at the production line, you need to have some contacts with industry. You cannot avoid saying, we don't talk to him, so you have to talk to them, but you should do it, the interactions, as limited as possible. So how would it work? Here we have data on the system in Brazil, and you have a barcode, and if you click on the barcode, it provides you information on date and location of the manufacturer facility, the intended market, and the product description. Here we have another example of tax stamps in the Philippines, and you have a QR code, which provides also information on manufacturer, production line, stamp order date, tax status, brand, intended market, and a unique marking. So that's always the protocols clearly says that you should have a unique marking for each package, for each carton, for each master case. And there we have our friends of the industry who have been pushing for Codentify. And according to the FCTC Secretariat, this is a system that is not controlled by the party, so it should not work in that way. In fact, what is Codentify? Codentify is not a track and trace system. Codentify is a system which produces unique codes. And in fact, they link it with a production code. So they have a production line, it's produced at a certain date, a certain hour, a certain minute, and they have a production code linked to that, and then they make some kind of a second code, which is an unpredictable 12-digit code. But the fact that they have invented this system of unique codes linked to the production information which they control makes it an unreliable system. So it's based on a patent of Codentify of 2005. In fact, they have been working on the system since 2001, 2002, when they negotiated, when Philip Morris negotiated an agreement with the European Union because they were being accused of smuggling in the European Union. It's very interesting to see that if you look at the patent, they show already the weakness of the system. You have a production code and a serial code. The serial code is the unique numbering. And it says also a limitation of this practice is that the production codes can be imitated or cloned. In fact, what you see in the pack is this 12-digit code, everybody can copy that or clone it, take some valid codes and then go to another factory in another country and reproduce these numbers anyway. So even in the Codentify patent application, they already show the weakness of the system. In the document of the FCTC Secretariat, they say very clearly that Codentify would not fit with the requirements of the FCTC protocol, and if parties would opt for Codentify, it would be opting for a black box with no guarantee that's under control of the party. The problem is that in all countries, in all regions of the world, the industry, Philip Morris made Codentify free to the 3 other main tobacco companies, and they give it now free to a new company, but it's the same people who are managing Codentify. They are pushing for Codentify at this moment. If countries adopt Codentify, we will be lost, because then we will have a system where the coding system of the unique identifiers will be controlled by the industry. In the EU, we have a tobacco product directive regulated by law, which stipulates that all tobacco products should be tracked and traced. They should have unique identifiers, and that the movements are recorded. This system will come into place in May 2019, but the standards for tracking and tracing will be decided at the end of 2017. So at the moment, we have a consultation on the EU tracking and tracing system, and the answers on the consultation process is the 4th of November. And it's amazing that in the consultation process, they say there are, in fact, 3 options for a system of tracking and tracing: an industry-operated system, a third independent party, and an industry third-party system. Can somebody explain how an industry-operated system is not in conflict with the WHO protocol if you say that the interactions with industry should be as limited as possible? It should be controlled by the party, and the duties and the obligations on the protocol cannot be delegated to the industry. So it's already amazing that you have 3 options, and the first option is in clear conflict with the WHO protocol. The EU has ratified the protocol in June of this year, so they are obliged to follow the obligations of the protocol. Then you have a third independent party, industry, are other options. So we conclude that what we see in Europe, but we see it also in Africa, we see it also in Latin America or in Asia, that industry is proposing their system, and that an industry-operated system is not an option and in conflict with the WHO FCTC. For those in the EU, they can still reply to the consultation process and make this clear to the EU authorities. So the conclusion of my presentation is that Codentify is being presented as something with production control, tax verification, authentication. This is completely useless because it's a visible code which can be easily cloned and copied. Codentify is not a tracking and tracing system, but is a code generating system under control of the tobacco industry because it's linked to the production codes. And an industry-operated system is not an option and in conflict with the WHO FCTC protocol. Thank you.
Thank you, Luc. Now we have a few minutes for questions of all the speakers, if anybody has any questions or points to make. Luc, what do you think the odds are that the EU will go for Codentify?
I'm sorry?
What do you think the odds are that the EU will go with Codify, notwithstanding all that? I mean, everyone's clear that it's not a tracking and tracing system and it's not going to be compliant with the protocol. What are the odds?
So how is the consultation process now? There is some work with the Commission, and in the Commission we have DG Sanko, which is the health division, who works with the tax division and with OLAF, with the anti-fraud divisions, and with the Secretary General. I think these people there are aware that there is a conflict. But it has to be agreed also with the 28 member states. And so the tactic of the industry is they have, what we know, agreements with Lithuania on tax verification. How can you do tax verification, give this to the industry to verify taxes? That's incredible. But anyway, they have an agreement with Lithuania, they have an agreement with Latvia, they have an agreement with Luxembourg. They, last month, the Prime Minister of Italy opened the factory of ICOS, Philip Morris product in Bologna. The Czech president normally is a good friend of Philip Morris. So they will work through the member states. And if they have enough member states, EU countries, which agree with the system, there could be a problem. So I don't know, but I cannot predict the outcome, but I would say there is a risk.
Any other questions of Luke or the other speakers?
Question from Luke. Luke, what's your prediction for once this is in place? How powerful will it be for really stopping governments from using the excuse of illicit trade for why they won't have, why they shouldn't have, significant tax increases? Do you see a lot of potential for it?
My guess is they will still use the same arguments. They will still continue, even based on all the evidence, the presentation of Jean on taxation. They will still repeat. They say it's different in our country. It's different. We use national data, and we cannot compare the UK. The UK is an island, so whatever. So they will still continue. But I think what would happen is if we have a system of track and trace and it works, it will have two consequences. It will have some influence on the manufacturing practices of the industry because there is more control. They have to control at the manufacturer level, they have more to control on the intended market, so it will have an effect on how they do business in the manufacturing facilities, and also it will facilitate investigations. But I guess they will still repeat their nonsense.
So, sorry, just a follow-up question then. So, are you looking to try and get, you've got Kenya and, there is some track and tracing happening. So, are we going to get some good case studies soon where the evaluation is going to be pretty strong so that we can see, because it's such a massive effort to get this protocol through, and I'm just wondering, it must be frustrating that it's taken so long, and are we going to have some good evidence base?
But the system in Kenya is based on tax stamps, which means that it's an excellent system to control the collection of taxes, but there is still not yet a system where you make the link between the packs, the cartons, master cases, and have a control. But what's happening in Kenya and Brazil and other countries is a step forward towards a full compliant tracking and tracing system.
Tanya? Yeah.
I'd like just to make a comment and something to hear on her presentation. She showed us that different arguments that the tobacco industry used to interfere in the taxation policy. And in Brazil, for example, the last reform in the taxation, we succeed to decrease very sharply the smoking prevalence, mainly among the low-income people. And by the other hand, we had also an increase of the revenue more than double because of the increase of price. And now we started to hear from the professor of tobacco industry that we have to pay attention on the Laffer curve. So this is something new for us from public health area to learn how to debate these issues. So this is only something that we have to have in mind because we have to learn so many different science to be discussing with the tobacco industry. So I'd like to hear.
The Laffer curve is not really science. It has not been proved anywhere.
Okay.
That's from the Reagan years in the US, when cut taxes and revenues will go up. It has never been shown to work in practice. It keeps getting dragged out, and now it's being dragged.
Yeah.
Even I have used it in a paper, a draft paper on tobacco tax.
Yeah.
No, it's a ghost.
It's a ghost. But
It's good to
it
hear.
sounds good, right? You know.
But if we have an end game, it will happen.
An
So,
end game, yes.
if it will happen, if there is no more tobacco products sold, there will be no revenue. But we are still not there.
And that would be a good day anyway, for other reasons.
Don't know if our tax departments would say that, but exactly, it's going to be a transition period. Any other questions? Probably don't really have time anyway, but if there's any burning question you have to ask, please maybe speak directly to the speakers on the completion of the session. So look, I'd like to thank all the speakers again for a really excellent session. I thought it really did hang together very nicely as a topic. So thank you, everybody.